Hello, everyone. We'll just give a couple of minutes while we have all the attendees join us. So just take a few minutes and then we'll start the webinar. But welcome all, and thank you for joining us today. Okay, so hello, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Prateek, and I work as Communications Officer at the UN Environment Program World Conservation Monitoring Center, UNEP-WCMC, in Cambridge, United Kingdom. This webinar is organized by the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative at UNEP-WCMC in partnership with the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network, BES-Net. I would like to thank you all for taking the survey during the registration. I would kindly ask my colleague Mel to please share the results in the chat for everyone's information. Today, we are exploring the connections between biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change. Addressing the challenges faced by these elements in isolation risks ineffective or even counterproductive outcomes. In this webinar, we are presenting the response options from the recently approved Nexus Assessment by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as IPBES. We will also be reflecting on the key takeaways from the BES-Net Trialogue, on how countries can use their enhanced understanding of the Nexus Assessment to inform national ecosystem assessments and broader national processes. Next slide, please. So I will briefly provide an overview of the agenda. First, my colleague Mel from the events team will inform you about some webinar housekeeping aspects, and we will also have an interesting icebreaker session. After that, Claire Brown, who is a principal technical specialist at UNEP-WCMC, will provide an overview of IPBES, National Ecosystem Assessments, and the Nexus Assessment. Tiff Van Heusen, who's the head of the Technical Support Unit at IPBES, will provide an overview of response options from the Nexus Assessment. Alexandra from UNDP will share the trialogue methodology in support of the IPBES uptake and its role in informing national actions. Lilian Chimpepo, who is the co-chair of the Malawi National Ecosystem Assessment, will discuss the Nexus response through the national ecosystem assessments and share experience on the regional trialogue. We will then move on to a question and answer session. I would, however, encourage all attendees to use Zoom's question and answer feature throughout the webinar. The webinar panel will do their best to respond to your questions. And finally, Vanita Chavez from UNEP-WCMC will deliver closing remarks for the webinar. I will now hand over the floor to my colleague Mel to take us through the housekeeping and icebreaker. Mel, welcome and over to you.
Thank you, and hi to everybody. Thank you for joining today. So we will be doing a short icebreaker, so please have your phones ready for that. But before we get into that, so just some quick housekeeping. So today's webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded onto the NEA Initiative website and the UNEP-WCMC YouTube channels. Please do let me know if you have any problems with this. Your microphone will be muted throughout the webinar. And as Pratik said, if you would like to comment or ask any questions, please do throughout the webinar using the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical problems, please do contact me and I will do my best to help. We also have interpretation today, live interpretation in English and Spanish. Again, this can be found at the bottom of your screen. Please do click this and select which language you prefer. So moving on to our icebreaker. So please, could you scan the QR code with your phone or go to menti.com and type in the code there. I will add the link to the chat as well. Okay. So let's begin. Hopefully everybody is able to access the Menti. Maybe I'll just give it a second, let people join. Okay, let's begin. Hopefully everybody is able to access it. As I said, the link is in the chat and the code is in the chat as well if you have any issues with the QR code. So first question, which words do you most associate with when you think about biodiversity? We've got some good ones here. Oh, nature, animals, flowers, nice. Health, that's a good one, yes. Wow, they move really quick. Species, conservation, resilience. Yes, some nice words coming in. Resilience, abundance, wilderness. Amazing. Wow, these are really good words. Okay, in the interest of time, we will move on to our next question. What do you think are the benefits that biodiversity provides to people or society? Requires a bit more thinking, this one. Health coming up. Yes, we've had a few health, well-being, food, symbiosis, ecosystems, harmony, well-being. Some themes here. Nice. Beauty, that's good, yes. Climate resilience. This is great. Resilience again, livelihoods, well-being again. Well-being's popular, yes. Everything, yeah. Absolutely. Wonderful. Okay, let's move on to our third question. Is, in what ways has biodiversity been affected by climate change? Another big one. Lots of responses we can have for this. Habitat, yeah, nature loss. Yeah, not such a positive question, but lots of good answers. Degradation, ecology, loss of habitat. Loss of species, coral, yes. Extreme weather. Okay. Reduced resilience. So we had resilience on one of the other ones. So it's interesting that climate change has reduced the resilience, people think. Stress. Okay, I'll leave this open, so please do feel free to continue to add your thoughts, and hopefully it will provide some useful context to the session today. So I will now pass back over to Pratik. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. That was excellent. And thank you, everyone, for sharing your responses. We've had some very interesting responses. Really liked it. So, yeah, now we will start with the first session for today. And the speaker will be Claire Brown, who is a Principal Technical Specialist at UNEP-WCMC. Claire has over 20 years experience and provides strategic oversight to a portfolio of projects on ecosystem services, ecosystem, and natural capital assessments, and natural capital counting from a technical and policy angle. Notably, Claire was involved in the UK National Ecosystem Assessment as an author and coordinator. Claire currently heads the IPBES Technical Support Unit for Policy Support. She sits on a variety of advisory boards, including Biodiversity Plus and the Natura Connect project, as well as project, proposal, and grant evaluation committees. Claire is a member of the EU subgroup on monitoring and assessment. She also reviews manuscripts for a wide range of journals. Claire, thank you for joining us today and welcome. Over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, for that introduction. And it's great to be here with over 100 participants. So I've been asked just to quickly reflect briefly on IPBES, the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative, and the Nexus Assessment. So we'll start at the beginning. So as we all know, IPBES was established in 2012 and has delivered since then a comprehensive work program. It covers many elements, and the one element that we are all very aware of is the assessments, and there's been a number of these. However, just to remind you, there are other functions to IPBES, including capacity building, knowledge generation, and policy support. Now, one of the unique features of IPBES is the recognition of its stakeholders and the role stakeholders can play in helping to deliver IPBES, or different activities to help IPBES realize its potential and impact. Now, there are a number of decisions which ask stakeholders to carry out these activities under different work plans, and UNDP, in collaboration with UNESCO and UNEP-WCMC, have taken up this challenge and through BES-Net and through the National Ecosystem Initiative carry out a number of activities to support countries. Now, these include supporting countries to undertake national ecosystem assessments, which are scaled down versions of what we're going to be listening to in a minute about the Nexus Assessment, which implement the IPBES conceptual framework and the assessment processes of IPBES. And there's a number of people online today who are members of these national assessment processes, and this allows them to also build their capacity at the national level and hopefully one day also contribute to an IPBES global assessment. These partners also come together through BES-Net to bring together governments, experts, other knowledge holders and practitioners to also reflect on IPBES assessments carried out at the global level and how these countries might reflect on these findings. So these could be done through the National Ecosystem Assessment, or could be actually developing other work streams and plans, and maybe it might be incorporating these findings into processes such as their national biodiversity strategy and action plans under the CBD process as well. Now, the landmark Nexus Assessment, which was approved at IPBES 11 in Namibia in December 2024, was carried out by over 165 interdisciplinary experts, and this assessment provides a comprehensive assessment of 5 interlinked global crises of biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change. It brings together an extraordinarily large amount of information. So it brings on this whole, where all these different elements intersect, and provides over 70 response options on how people might want to tackle this crisis. So with this wealth of information, countries are in a good position to think about how these crises mean in their own country-specific context and how they might respond. So I'm going to leave it there in the interest of time, and I'm going to, because I also am looking forward to hearing from Tiff about the Nexus Assessment and Malawi, about how they're going to tackle these problems and the roadmap they've put out in front of them. So thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy the next couple of presentations, and I'll hand back to Patrick.
Thank you so much, Claire. And now we will move to the next session. And the speaker is Tiff Van Heusen, who is the head of the Technical Support Unit for the Nexus Assessment at IPBES. Tiff is a Program Management Officer at IPBES, and she's an interdisciplinary scientist by training with a PhD in Ecosystem Ecology, followed by a return to school to complete an MA in Climate and Society that integrated studies of climate change, sustainable development, and human rights. Tiff worked for the United States Department of Agriculture twice, the first time managing an applied regional research program to inform transboundary natural resource management, and the second time coordinating an applied natural research network focused on agroecosystems. She has taught courses on both climate change and agroecosystems, co-authored publications on climate services, among others, and is co-author of Sustainable Food Production, a primer on the environmental sustainability of food and farming. Tiff is currently based at the IPBES Secretariat in Bonn, Germany. Tiff, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Pratik, and thank you for having me. It's nice to see everyone. Okay, I think we can just go to the next slide. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so this has already been mentioned several times. Pratik mentioned it in the introduction to the webinar, and Claire just mentioned it. But the Nexus Assessment calls attention to these 5 global crises, explaining how they are connected, how they interact, and how they exacerbate each other. And that separate efforts to address these are ineffectual precisely because they are connected. So an example would be that if there's a change in land use, which leads to unsustainable food production to address food insecurity, this contributes to biodiversity loss and exacerbates climate change through increased greenhouse gas emissions. And those in turn then can affect water quality and health, for example, through extreme heat events. So what the Nexus Assessment does is it provides an alternative and a more integrated approach to addressing these crises. And one of the components of this approach are what we call Nexus response options. And these are actions or policies to support holistic governance and management of the Nexus elements and their interactions. And again, those are biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about what these responses are. So they're really solutions, and the assessment provides a range of solutions. And they were selected not only because they have positive impacts across the nexus, so for multiple nexus elements, but also because of their potential to be available to multiple actors working within and across sectors. And these options can be applied at different spatial and temporal scales and adapted to different contexts. And so in the report, there are over 70 response options assessed, and they were assessed using a common scoring methodology across the Chapter 5 subchapters, which is where these response options are housed. Next slide, please. So, in the summary for policymakers of the report, the response options were clustered into 10 categories, which are shown here in what we refer to as the wheel. And these are categories for action, and each of them includes at least one response option of each of the nexus elements. And these categories really underpin the messages that are in the summary for policymakers. So in addition to showing the breadth of the response options that are available, this figure also shows that there's options for opportunities for cross-sectoral collaboration because there are actors focusing on different elements, but they're working towards similar aims, so similar options or options that have the same aim. And so there's a real opportunity here for more integrated approaches that can lead to nexus-wide benefits. Next slide, please. So this is a map that's showing focal response options. So this is a figure that is in one of the chapter 5 sub-chapters. And focal response options are options that were described and assessed in more detail within the chapters. So this is only a subset of the response options. Within the chapters, there are examples from over 40 countries. But I just wanted to show this figure because it really highlights that there is evidence for response options being implemented worldwide. Next slide, please. Okay. So as I briefly mentioned, the response options were selected for their potential benefits across the nexus elements. And indeed, many of the response options do benefit multiple elements. So the figure you're viewing is a representation of the impact of a given response option on each of the nexus elements. And the response option, again, are categorized on the same categories used in the wheel figure. So the response options are listed reading down, and then their impacts for each element of the nexus are shown reading left to right, with blue dots representing positive impacts for that element, red dots representing negative impacts, and with the larger the dot, the larger the impact. So the point of showing this, and this is just part of the figure, it's in the summary for policymakers, is that there are a lot of blue dots, indicating that many of the response options that were assessed confer benefits to multiple nexus elements. Next slide, please. However, as you might have noticed in the previous figure, there are different size dots. So while there are many benefits, the response option impacts do vary. And thus, depending on an actor's goals or needs, there may be trade-offs between response options that need to be managed. So this is just one example. This shows 2 response options that originate from the climate change element. So the one on the left is restoration of coastal and marine systems, and it has positive benefits for all the nexus elements, some larger than others. On the right side shows offshore wind, which is another response option within the climate change element. But you can see that option really only benefits climate change and has negative impacts on the other elements. So again, when thinking about what response options to implement for a given challenge, these trade-offs may need to be minimized. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then another, I think, cool thing that we did in the Nexus assessment was that in addition to looking at the impacts on the Nexus elements, the report also assessed whether the response options support 3 global policy frameworks. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and also the Paris Agreement. So this figure is also in the summary for policymakers. It's just part of the figure. But what it shows is support for each of the Sustainable Development Goals and each of the Global Biodiversity Framework targets broken down by nexus element. And so you can see that all of the goals and all of the targets are supported by multiple response options. So in addition to providing another opportunity for synergistic efforts to address global challenges, this shows that for the policy frameworks can also inform national level planning and decision making. Next slide, please. And then finally, just to wrap up, just a few points about relevancy for the National Ecosystem Assessments, which closely follows the IPBES assessment process. And really, it's just about providing evidence for the response options, their benefits, the magnitude of those benefits, and identifying synergies and trade-offs. It can also help inform opportunities for scaling response options, i.e., putting response options in places where they currently are not in place. And then finally, and I think really critically, is reinforcing the importance of full and effective participation for a wide range of actors to increase not only the magnitude of the benefits, but ensuring that there are equitable outcomes when it comes to implementing response options. And that's all I have for slides. There's this QR code that you can scan, which will take you to the IPBES Nexus Assessment webpage. And from there, you can access the most current version of the summary for policymakers. And then I don't have a slide on this, but I am to remind you that IPBES is currently running a stakeholder survey, and they only do the survey every 5 years. So if you are registered with IPBES, you should have received an email with a unique link to the survey. I believe the last email reminder was sent on March 12th. So if you are registered with IPBES, please go find that email buried in your inbox and fill out the survey, because that's really important in for informing the future work of IPBES. Thank you so much, and back to you, Pratik.
Thank you, Tiff, for the excellent and insightful presentation. Yes, so we will now move on to our next session, and we have Alexandra, who is a Partnership and Development Facilitation Specialist at UNDP, cultivating shared spaces for dialogue and collaboration across cultures and disciplines. Alexandra specializes in partnership development and policy dialogue in biodiversity and sustainable development. As a partnership development and facilitation specialist with the UNDP, she designs and facilitates multi-stakeholder dialogues, known as trialogues, under the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network. Her work bridges policy, science, and practice, ensuring inclusive engagement processes where diverse perspectives contribute to evidence-informed decision-making. Before joining BES-Net, Alexandra spent over a decade working on sustainable development initiatives in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, supporting governments, local communities, and civil society in advancing cross-sectoral partnerships. Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us today at the webinar. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Pratik, for this warm introduction and warm welcome. Hello all. A big welcome back to the participants of the trialogues. Some of you I saw in the chat, very familiar names. Great to have you here. So today, invited by the organizers of this webinar, I will be just very briefly sharing about the trialogue methodology, what it is, and with the next slide, I will be speaking about why we need a trialogue in the context of IPBES uptake, as well as national ecosystem assessments, partially. So many of us in our life, in our experiences, very diverse settings, have encountered this situation when we do have a perception of reality, but maybe it is not complete. Or if we are completely frank, it is rarely complete. Oftentimes, perhaps you found yourself in a situation where you had a sense of what you're experiencing, but only by having a dialogue, by exchanging with others, or with the other, with the capital O, you actually had a richer understanding of what this experience is about. So this is what we're trying to accomplish with the trialogues. As the figure on the left shows, this is the metaphor of three men encountering an object, which is an elephant, but only once they speak to each other, they actually realize that this is their shared experience and understand it better. As somebody rightly put in the chat, yes, this methodology applies well when we want to go beyond that tip of the iceberg and actually look into the circumstances that are larger and those underlying patterns or structures that form what we perceive as challenge. And this applies to the IPBES context. Because sometimes when we look into thematic assessments, and in the next slide, I will show you the thematic assessments of IPBES and regional assessments that we tackled as a trialogue. So sometimes when we see the thematic focus only, we have a challenge in understanding how to create action, shared action on this specific theme. And that's why through this trialogue methodology, multi-stakeholder engagement methodology, bringing together practice, science, and policy sectors, so triangular dialogue between these three communities, that we can come up with actions that can be applicable at the national level, but also the regional or subnational level, depending on the circumstances. We had a number of trialogues. For the sake of time, I will skip this part, but we'll put in the chat a link if you want to take a closer look at the application of the trialogue. And yes, we will be definitely sharing the resources on this. And also the participants of the trialogue who are here in the room, if you want to share your experience in the chat, you're also very much welcome. Now I will just conclude linking it to the Nexus assessment. So from Tiff's presentation before, you perhaps had the perception that to apply those response options, we need to go beyond silos approach, beyond silos, and apply Nexus approach. So we've been trying to do it with the trialogue, and we had our most recent experience that I'll show you in the next slide. That is on East and Southern Africa, just concluded last month in February in Namibia, where for the first time we brought the Nexus assessment to the attention of the participants. And the results, well, may be shared with you later on, but what I can say from my part is that it is a must to apply Nexus approach in the trialogues to find those, to co-create those shared solutions that tackle multiple challenges and that actually bring response options that have multiple benefits and that have those incremental benefits that Tiff mentioned earlier on. We have 6 countries from East and Southern Africa. 2 of these countries are actually countries that are undertaking the National Ecosystem Assessment, and it also resonated quite well with them. And I think one of the next speakers will go deeper into this. I am at your disposal for any questions that you might have in the following half an hour. And if you're interested, beyond the links that I will put in the chat, take a look at this QR code that I put on the slide. You can scan it and read more about the latest trialogue. And if you're curious or interested, take a look at our website, stay in touch with BES-Net, and also try to stay in touch with the participants of the previous trialogues to see how these actions were applied in their context. I think this is all from my side. Pratik, I will give it back over to you and happy to answer questions as they come.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your presentation. That was excellent. And yes, please feel free to drop in links and resources regarding BES-Net and Trialogue in the chat for everybody's information. We will now move on to our next session by Lilian Chimpepo, who is the co-chair of the Malawi National Ecosystem Assessment. Lilian is also the principal environmental officer in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Climate Change, specifically working under the Environmental Affairs Department of Malawi. She holds a PhD in conservation biology and currently serves as the national focal point for IPBES. With over 20 years of experience in biodiversity conservation and natural resource management, Lilian has made significant contributions to the field at local and international level. She plays a pivotal role in providing policy guidance for the implementation of the Malawi National Ecosystem Assessment Project, where she co-chairs the terrestrial chapter. Lilian, thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar, and welcome. I will now hand over the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm happy to share the experience of Malawi National Ecosystem Assessment and also the experience that we had during the regional trialogue in Namibia. Next slide, please. Okay, so as an introduction, Malawi launched the National Ecosystem Assessment in the year 2020. And for our National Ecosystem Assessment, we are focusing on 3 thematic areas. So we are looking at the terrestrial ecosystem, aquatic ecosystem, and wetland ecosystem. The picture there just shows the waters. Malawi is one of the countries which is rich in terms of aquatic ecosystem. We have the freshwater lake in Malawi, and also the large part of our land is terrestrial. Next slide, please. So our National Ecosystem Assessment report will have about 7 chapters. The first chapter, which is an introduction, is giving an overview, introduction to the country as Malawi, and also an overview of the National Ecosystem Assessment, why as a country we decided to conduct the National Ecosystem Assessment, and for some are obviously for planning purposes, conservation planning, and as we are revising our national biodiversity strategy and action plan, the national ecosystem, the knowledge that we'll have from the national ecosystem assessment will guide in setting realistic targets. Chapter 2 talks about the methodology, the approaches that we use. We use the whole government, whole society approach, and also the multiple evidence-based approach. It's a methodology which was also adopted from the IPBES methodology. Chapter 3, 4, and 5, we had policy questions which these chapters are addressing in the scoping report. Chapter 6, which is the Nexus chapter, where we are looking at the 3 ecosystems that we are looking at, see how they are interlinkages and dependent on each other. And finally, chapter 7 will be on recommendation and conclusion. But within the chapter 3, 4, and 5, we also have some scenarios developed to see what the future holds if we take business as usual or we use other options, transformative change. Next slide, please. So in case of how the National Ecosystem Assessment is addressing the linkages among the 3 ecosystems, as I said, we are having a standalone chapter on the Nexus. So we'll evaluate the knowledge that is available in terms of terrestrial ecosystem and how the changes in the terrestrial ecosystem can affect the aquatic ecosystem as well as the wetland ecosystem, because we know that on the buffer zone of the aquatic ecosystem and wetland, there is a terrestrial, and whatever will happen in the terrestrial ecosystem, in one way or another, it will affect the aquatic ecosystem as well as the wetland ecosystem. So all the 3 chapters, and I can say throughout the ecosystem assessment, we have mainstreamed indigenous and local knowledge. So we have co-created the knowledge with the indigenous people participating, providing their insight, their perspective in terms of how to manage biodiversity, and also including the status of biodiversity, the trends over the years. The indigenous and local communities are very key in this national ecosystem assessment, because all the plans that we make at national level, when it comes to implementation, it is these local communities who are in the forefront in the implementation. So we have mainstreamed ILK throughout. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to emphasize on the Nexus chapter, that we want by the end, this chapter should provide an understanding of the linkages and interdependence among the 3 ecosystem types evaluated in the National Ecosystem Assessment, We also want to develop integrated and adaptive decisions to maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs. In most cases, for example, I'll give an example of forestry. Sometimes when we have forest land degradation, then the solution comes to say, okay, let's restore, let's do afforestation without thinking about the type of species that we are using. So sometimes you find introduction of invasive alien species coming in. And when you look at some of the attributes of invasive alien species, some are water based, so they will also absorb all the waters, and in the end, we find the aquatic ecosystem and wetlands are suffering. So we want to minimize trade-off through the evaluation that is going to be done in the Nexus chapter. We also want to enhance holistic management and governance. In most cases, the sectors that work in the terrestrial ecosystem are not the same as those who look at the wetland and aquatic. So we work in silos in most cases. However, with the knowledge that we have gained from the Nexus assessment at global level, we have seen the need for us to make sure that there is an holistic management and governance of most of the elements that are found in the different chapters that we are looking at. And also, though in our case, we are not specifically isolating the Nexus elements, but we believe that in all the three ecosystem assessment that we are evaluating, we have all these. We have water, the food, biodiversity, and health. So whilst we are looking at the ecosystem types, we also look at these elements to see how in the aquatic ecosystem, for example, how biodiversity is being affected by the change in the terrestrial ecosystem. Similarly, what is happening in terms of the changes that happen in the aquatic ecosystem when it comes to human health. Next slide, please. So in terms of how the Nexus assessment can support the National Ecosystem Assessment, the approach that we have used in our National Ecosystem Assessment, we actually have adapted it from the Nexus assessment. So we have used that approach. And also when we look at the response options, we feel the Nexus assessment has provided us with a list of options which we can adopt as a country to fit our own context. And also, we have seen that the Nexus assessment will inform our assessment on how to identify opportunities and opportunities for collaboration. We see if we have really to come up with an impact. If our response options are going to make an impact, we need to see which stakeholders are involved, which stakeholders should we engage to address a common, to reach a common goal. So in terms of land degradation, for example, if we have rains and then if the land is degraded, the land of the water, the dirty water will go into the aquatic ecosystem. And then we have to think about which sectors are involved in addressing land degradation, which sectors are involved in addressing issues of aquatic. We look at the fisheries, we look at the forestry, we look at the communities themselves. Then we see with this evaluation of the Nexus, we can have an opportunity to see which stakeholders to collaborate with. It also helps us to select options that provide positive impact on biodiversity. So we are maximizing the impact. So we look at the options which will maximize the impact. If we look at the options that have been provided as already presented, you see that the bigger the circle which for positive impact, the more or the stronger the positive impact on biodiversity. We also use those findings to see and evaluate, assess the option that we are selecting for response and to see which ones have maximum impact. And also just to emphasize, in order to avoid unplanned trade-offs, we really need this Nexus assessment. And this also will inform holistic management and governance of different ecosystems. In Malawi, we do have several policies. Each sector has their own policies, and we tend really to work in isolation. But with the Nexus Assessment, we are promoting that we need to work together so that we achieve biodiversity conservation, we achieve climate mitigation and adaptation, as well as human health. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so that was about the Nexus Assessment, what we have learned and what we are learning from, and already we are using the knowledge that we have gained from the Nexus Assessment. But now going to the regional trialogue experience. As Alexandra said, Malawi is one of the countries which participated in the regional assessment in Namibia, and we learned a lot. The trialogue was focusing on the two thematic assessment, which was conducted by IPBES. So we have a thematic assessment on invasive alien species and on sustainable use of wildlife. So as a region, we had an opportunity to explore the common challenges in the region and also explore some opportunities for collaboration. A case in hand is the invasive alien species. When we look at invasive alien species, we saw that we can easily work together because in most cases, when we look at the pathways where how the invasive alien species are introduced in an area, there is that cross-border movement of animals, cross-border movement of species, could be plant species, some intentionally, some unintentionally, like the disposal for the countries. Some countries, like in our case, Zambia, Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, our borders are just imaginary lines. We can move across the borders. People can exchange plant materials at will without knowing that they're introducing species. So we also shared how, as neighboring countries, how as a region, we can be able to address the issues of invasive alien species in our countries. And we also shared we learned a lot in terms of innovations on how we can control invasive alien species. Sometimes we can look at innovative, where innovative means of making use of the invasive alien species for the benefit, could be economically benefit. An example is charcoal for energy source. Sometimes instead of people using the indigenous trees, which are good, they can use invasive alien species to come up with, to produce charcoal, which can be used for their economic benefit as well as for their livelihood. We also we actually developed our action plan, and this was supported with the options that we got from the Nexus Assessment. We created actionable solutions to address invasive alien species in our respective countries, as well as wildlife issues. We had a visit to a botanical garden in Namibia, and we learned a lot from there. We learned how they preserve different species, those which are threatened, how they conserve the species, how they have the gene bank. It is something that was interesting to learn, and we can actually adopt some of the measures they are using so that we can also improve in our countries. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the picture you are seeing is an example of what we saw when we reached the botanical garden. What they do, they disseminate messages on how to make sure that invasive alien species are not spreading in the botanical garden. So they would put a picture, like in this case, a picture of a grass which is invasive, and then they will say rather dead than alive. So the visitors to the botanical garden, they are informed to uproot any invasive species which they see in the botanical garden. So in terms of the action plan, which I said we also developed as Malawi, we had 4 ambitious goals. which we want to embark on when, as we are here now, as we are back from the trialogue. The first one, we have to restore degraded ecosystem. The second one, we want to enhance management and control of invasive alien species. Fortunately for us, we already have the national invasive management strategy and action plan. So we can leverage on that, and also with the knowledge that we gain from our colleagues, we can enhance measures on how to control and manage invasive alien species. And the third one is to improve awareness, knowledge sharing, and dissemination, one of which I have already highlighted in terms of what the botanical garden in Namibia are doing. And lastly, we also want to improve our food security. So I've just isolated one priority area or one ambition, which is the first one, to restore restoration of the degraded ecosystem. And from the Nexus response actions which we saw that there is one of the option is to halt convention of ecosystem of high ecological integrity. And from the finding of the Nexus report, there is a stronger positive impact on biodiversity, water, and climate change, and a weaker positive on food and health. So we saw that this, if we can implement at national level from the Nexus report, it can also help to improve water availability in our country, mitigation of climate change, as well as improving biodiversity conservation in the country. Next slide, please. That's the last one. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm available for any question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for such an insightful presentation. And it was really interesting to see the kind of communication that is employed regarding invasive alien species. That was really engaging and interesting to learn. So yeah, we have now moved on to our next session, which is a question and answer session. And I would really encourage all the attendees to please feel free to ask your questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature. And I will bring them to the attention of our panelists today. We have a question on Malawi already, and I will say it aloud. So the question is, in Malawi, as part of biodiversity conservation, is there any work on indigenous seeds savings? Are there any challenges by the agrovet big companies that discourage this threat to biodiversity conservation efforts for local communities? Or is there full support by the Malawian government? Lillian, maybe that is a question for you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, there is. We have our Ministry of Agriculture and the Department of Agriculture Research Service. They have a section of gene bank, so they don't only conserve or preserve a hybrid seed, but they focus on indigenous seed, the local seed, and they go as far as looking at the wild relative of crops wild relatives. So there are efforts which are done to conserve local or indigenous seeds in the country, basically the crops. In terms of whether there are any hindrance or any challenges, I think the challenge that I can say is the support is there. There is political will, there is support, because we believe the local or indigenous seed bank is good for research. It's a source of genetic resource for improving or conducting research. However, the challenge is maybe the infrastructure to make sure that they preserve the seed for a long time. In terms of usage of indigenous seed or local seeds, there is it's like nowadays people are preferring hybrids because of high yielding. Most indigenous or local seeds are low yielding, though they are good. They have some traits, other traits which are good, but in terms of production, most of the local seeds are low yielding. So people are going for, they are preferring hybrids. However, the Ministry of Agriculture is trying to bring in issue of crop diversification and improving seeds, local seeds, without making them hybrid, just closing the local seeds so that they can get the trait that is good in the local seeds to the farmers. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian, for such a comprehensive response. And thank you, Ogwa and Robert, for your question. We have one more question, and that is question from Priyabrata Das. Are there any protective measures to conserve blue carbon ecosystem which will create harmony with society and environment? So if any of the panelists feel that they would like to answer this question, please feel free to just unmute yourself. Maybe Lillian, I think that question is intended for Malawi. I will repeat again. Are there
Yes,
any
please.
protective measures to conserve blue carbon ecosystem which will create harmony with the society and environment?
Thank you very much for that question. I believe you are talking about the waters. The blue carbon should be water. It's not aquatic ecosystem. Yes. In Malawi, there are efforts to preserve the blue carbon to the extent that we have we have part of Lake Malawi, which has been designated as a protected area under the national parks and wildlife. So it's a protected area just to make sure that they preserve the endemic species that we have in Malawi, as well as to protect the waters of Malawi. So that we can continue. You know, part of the waters in Malawi, from Lake Malawi, are actually tapped for drinking, and also our lake is known to have a high diversity of species, and some of them are endemic, especially the cichlids are endemic. So we have, as a country, there are some efforts that are being done to make sure that we protect the lake, we preserve the lake and the biodiversity within the lake. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lillian. And I think I have one more question from you, from Debasa. Thank you, Debasa. So Lillian, I will say the question out loud. The question is on the NEA of Malawi. The ecosystems identified seems at a coarse level. For example, when they say terrestrial ecosystem, is it possible to zoom out several ecosystems like agroecosystem, rangeland, grassland, mountain, and vegetation ecosystem? Could not such kind of assessment at coarse scale lead to missing of information? Moreover, the difference between aquatic and wetland ecosystem is also confusing to tell apart, for we do not have globally agreed definition of these terms. Ramsar Convention definition, which was coined in 1973, is not working across regions, especially where there is no marine, for example. So I will hand over the floor to you, Lillian.
Thank you very much for that question. Let me start with the terrestrial ecosystem. Yeah, the terrestrial ecosystem actually is the largest because, as you rightly said, it includes even the agricultural land. So we have a section that deals with agricultural land. We also have a section that deals with the forest. The section that deals, so with the forest, we have protected forest reserves, and we also have national parks and wildlife reserves, game reserves, as well as the mountains. So indeed, the forest, the terrestrial ecosystem is very big. So we have different can I say subsections of the terrestrial ecosystem. In terms of aquatic and wetland, we also had a challenge when we are deciding whether we should separate wetland from aquatic, because both of them they do have the waters. So in terms of aquatic, aqua is the water, and so we use the LAMSA definition for the wetland. That the aquatic ecosystem we are looking at, the wetland ecosystem we are looking at the water bodies which are less than 1.5 meter deep, and also those which are just water saturated areas as our wetlands. So the LAMSA definition was the one which was adopted. Because in Malawi, for the aquatic, we were taking the lakes and the rivers. But for the aquatic, we're taking of the dambo lands. As I said, the LAMSA definition applied for the aquatic ecosystem. And if it was the same reasoning to say that, just like you have said that the terrestrial is very broad, if we are to just say aquatic, it could have also been very broad, because in Malawi we do have so many rivers, so many wetlands, those which we define as wetland, and also we have about 3 lakes. So we wanted to narrow down, to split the aquatic into 2, wetland and aquatic proper. I hope I have responded to your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lillian. And now, in the interest of time, I will now move to our final session for the day. Please feel free to send us your questions, and we will do our best to answer them after the webinar as well. And I also understand there were a lot of questions for Malawi as well. So we would be happy to share further information about the Malawi National Ecosystem Assessment after the webinar with all the attendees and registrants. So our final speaker for the day is Juanita Chavez, who is a Senior Program Officer at UNEP-WCMC. And sorry, my video was off. Juanita is the project lead for the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative and is responsible for the overall management and delivery of the project. Her background includes a master's degree in natural resources law. Prior to UNEP-WCMC, Juanita participated in the National Ecosystem Assessment of Colombia. She was also responsible for coordinating the fast-track assessment for the Amazon region. Juanita, thank you so much for joining us today at the webinar, and over to you.
Thank you very much. And giving the short close remarks, let me thank the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection of the Federal Republic of Germany, and the International Climate Initiative, IKI, that allowed us to organize this fantastic webinar. And we have been hearing about the connection of the global crisis, biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution, and the need to get away of this isolation perspective and way of acting and solving this global crisis, and move towards a more interlinked approach. And we have heard that in order to do that, this very value added coming from the IPBES assessment with the response options, which also implied, of course, the need to bring different and multiple stakeholders and approaches into these discussions. We heard from Alexandra how the trialogue methodology is actually supporting this multi-stakeholder engagement and the different views in the discussions of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and of course, enhancing this cross-sectoral collaboration as one of the benefits of these integrated approaches. I think that is also very interesting to highlight how the National Ecosystem Assessment of Malawi is actually addressing the Nexus approach. And for me, it was very interesting to hear from Lillian the 2 ways of how they are approaching this. One in terms of the ecosystems that are part of the scoping of their national ecosystem assessments, by bringing this approach in the analysis of the ecosystems, terrestrial, the three ecosystems that they're studying, and also within each of the ecosystems in terms of how they are analyzing the relationships between water, food, biodiversity, and health. So that was also very, very good. It's been very valuable to also oversee the different scales of the implications of the Nexus approach from the global perspective with IPBES and now with this IPBES assessment, but also at national level, and how the IPBES assessment could also amplify, of course, the messages of the national ecosystem assessment's findings, and how they are also approaching a Nexus discussion and analysis to address the different drivers of loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and providing different scenarios as well for the best futures that could respond to these global crises. So thank you very much to everyone. Just an invitation again to have a look to the Nexus assessment, to strengthen the cross-sector collaboration and discussions when analyzing these different issues, and hope to see you all very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita, for your final remarks. And before we finally say goodbye to you today, I would just like to share with you that the National Ecosystem Assessment Initiative is coming up with plans for a newsletter. And we would really like you to, share with you your preferences for some of the topics in this newsletter. So please take this survey and let us know what your preferences are, and we will do our best to accommodate them when we launch the inaugural edition of the newsletter very soon. Next slide, please. And I also now invite you to join the Subglobal Assessment Network to stay up to date with all the latest news. We will also be sending out the newsletter to this network and stay up to date with all the upcoming events and webinars. So please join this network and stay up to date with all the news and events. Next slide, please. And well, thank you. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for today for their excellent sessions. They were so insightful, as well as they ensured that we were able to answer all the questions swiftly. So many thanks to all the panelists today for taking time joining us today, as well as to all the attendees for joining us today. We do hope that you found the webinar useful. We will definitely follow up with sharing all the resources, recording. And many thanks to the interpreters as well for doing an excellent job with the interpretation. So yes, thank you. Thank you so much all. And we look forward to welcoming you to another webinar in the future. Thank you.